Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history gets strange, but the voice stays calm. Tonight we're exploring what dating was like in the medieval world, a time when love was arranged by law, supervised by clergy, and occasionally interrupted by livestock. Before you settle in, take a quiet moment to like this video or subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy falling asleep to humanity's poor attempts at romance. And if you're still awake enough, drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting to know how many of us are awake at unreasonable hours, each in our own small corner of history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's drift together into a world where affection came with paperwork and poetry came with fines. If your mind wanders, that's perfectly fine. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. You might think love is universal, that somewhere, deep down, people have always fallen for each other the same way. Eyes meeting, hearts racing, bad poetry following. In the medieval world, not quite. Romance was not personal. It was public property. Every flutter of emotion was expected to pass through the church, the family, and a small but determined army of neighbours who had opinions about everything. Love was less about butterflies, more about boundaries. For most of medieval Europe, the idea of dating didn't exist. You didn't go out with someone, mainly because there was nowhere to go that didn't belong to the church, a landlord, or the weather. Affection operated on a timetable set by harvests, market days, and marriage bans. If you wanted a spouse, you needed a plan, not a playlist. The church called marriage a sacred union, a bond between souls, sanctioned by God, witnessed by priests, and recorded by whoever could write legibly. But beneath the halos of theology sat the fine print. A union wasn't sealed by romance, it was sealed by consent. Canon lawyers loved that word. Consent. In soft translation, it simply meant both people had to agree, out loud, preferably in front of someone else. I do wasn't just poetic, it was legally binding, and it had to be said correctly, in the right order, without hesitation. Because if you mumbled, a notary might have to step in and clarify whether you had just promised eternal love or a short-term rental arrangement. Of course, this elegant theory didn't stop families from organising everything in advance. Parents arranged matches like land deals, a dowry here, a vineyard there, a cousin no one liked thrown in for diplomacy. Marriage, at its core, was a spreadsheet disguised as a sacrament. Sons were assets, daughters were investments. The church simply audited the feelings. If you were lucky, you married within your village someone you already knew from the market or from mutual cow ownership. If you were noble, you might never meet your intended until the day of the ceremony, and sometimes not even then, depending on how large your veils were. The goal was stability, inheritance, and the continuation of property through generations. Love could follow later, preferably after the accounts were balanced. To make things official, the church introduced the bans. Public announcements made 3 Sundays in a row, listing who planned to marry whom. Theoretically, this allowed the community to object if the couple were too closely related. In practice, it let everyone gossip for 3 solid weeks. If no one screamed cousins by the 3rd Sunday, congratulations, you were engaged. The logic behind it was almost bureaucratically sweet. Love needed oversight. It had to be visible, traceable, and ideally taxable. A secret wedding, though romantic in stories, was legally suspicious. The medieval world loved ceremony. The more candles, witnesses, and paperwork, the better. If you wanted privacy, you had chosen the wrong century. It wasn't all solemnity. There were moments of awkward charm. In small villages, potential couples might exchange gifts, not flowers or jewellery, but practical things. A loaf of bread, a carved spoon, a chicken. You could call it pragmatic romance, the kind that keeps you fed through winter. Wealthier suitors commissioned rings or embroidered tokens. These were early status updates. proof that something was happening, even if slowly. Still, love wasn't lawless. The church kept close watch on who could marry whom. There were forbidden degrees of kinship, extending so far that sometimes no one in the village was technically allowed to marry anyone else. Special dispensations existed, of course, but they required payment and patience, the medieval version of a premium subscription to affection. And then there was the question of proof. To confirm a marriage, courts might demand evidence that the couple had indeed said the right words and eventually done the right deeds. Some trials involved witnesses testifying about who had been seen together, under what circumstances, and whether the bed had, in fact, been shared. It was romance, cross-examined. Yet for all its rules, the system worked, in its own oddly comforting way. Love might have been arranged, but so was everything else. Harvests, taxes, festivals, and even when you were allowed to take a day off from sinning. People adapted. Affection found small corners, in glances over bread stalls, in songs sung after evening prayers, in the brief brush of sleeves at market gates. The heart still found ways to misbehave, even while supervised. Sometimes, two people would promise themselves to each other privately without witnesses. These were called clandestine marriages, and the church hated them almost as much as it feared them. Because if a union could begin with just 2 whispered words, it could also vanish with silence. So the church doubled down on rules: 3 public bans, a priest, a contract, and preferably a relative who could remind everyone about the property lines. You might think this sounds cold, but there was warmth hidden in the structure. Stability mattered. A family that stayed intact survived better than one that followed passion into poverty. And within the strict routine, real tenderness grew, quiet, habitual, steady. Love wasn't about fireworks, it was about survival and shared work. If you were a young peasant looking for affection, your flirtations might happen while hauling water, or threshing grain, or helping repair the roof before winter. Romantic gestures were measured in effort, not eloquence. You didn't send flowers, you fixed fences. You didn't serenade, you shared chores. In a world where every day could be a test of endurance, that kind of companionship was worth more than poetry. Of course, poetry still existed, written by men who could afford not to work. But for most, affection was practical, mutual, and occasionally exasperated, which, come to think of it, isn't so different from today. Somewhere between the sermons, the bans, and the barter, you start to realise that medieval people weren't unromantic. They were just realistic. Love had to fit into a world that never stopped demanding labour, tithes and obedience. It had to endure frost, famine, and the occasional priest with opinions about your cousin's dowry. It had to be humble, and in that humility, perhaps, it became something closer to loyalty than passion, something quieter, sturdier, and far more sustainable than any courtly verse could promise. By now you understand that love in the Middle Ages was an organised affair, complete with witnesses, ledgers, and maybe a supervising goat. But not everyone was content with practicality. Some people, mostly wealthy, literate, and bored, decided love should be a work of art. They called it courtly love, though it had very little to do with courts, and even less to do with love as you might know it. It was more like a performance, a long dramatic poem where everyone wore velvet and no one ever touched. The idea began in 12th century southern France, in the sun-drenched castles of lords who had too much time and not enough wars. Troubadours, men with lutes and suspiciously intense gazes, wandered from court to court, composing songs for noble ladies who were already married to someone else. They sang of devotion, purity, and longing. The goal was not to possess the beloved, but to suffer gracefully in her direction. It was a system where pain was proof of sincerity, and restraint was the only acceptable form of passion. One popular handbook, written by a man named Andreas Capellanus, explained how love worked in 31 convenient rules. In soft translation, the rules said things like, love is always born of jealousy. No one should be deprived of love without reason, and marriage is no excuse for not loving. That last one was especially popular among poets, and significantly less so among priests. The church frowned on this entire enterprise, though politely, because many of its sponsors were the same nobles funding the cathedrals. At its best, courtly love was refined heartbreak with good lighting. A knight might dedicate years to serving a lady he could never have. He would wear her colours on his sleeve, literally a piece of her fabric tied there like a small flag of hopelessness. He would ride into tournaments, perform brave acts, and write verses comparing her to saints, stars, or any other object far out of reach. The lady, meanwhile, would thank him with a glance, perhaps a handkerchief, and return to her husband's dinner table feeling mildly flattered and completely untouchable. This was love as metaphor, polished and rehearsed. It had its rituals, secret letters folded like origami of longing, coded messages passed through servants, glances exchanged across chapel aisles. Every gesture meant something. The way a ribbon was tied, the way a glove was dropped, the way a word was emphasized in a poem. Historians sometimes call it symbolic literacy. Romantics call it agony with good manners. For most participants, the experience stayed safely hypothetical, but occasionally fantasy overflowed into scandal. A knight might interpret a smile as destiny and end up banished for confusing metaphor with invitation. A noble woman might respond to too many poems and find herself in need of confession. In this world, falling in love could be more dangerous than battle, because you couldn't fight gossip with a sword. The church issued stern warnings about adultery disguised as artistry. Yet the songs kept spreading. Love, it turned out, travelled faster than sin. What made this culture so powerful was its illusion of purity. The poets insisted that true love ennobled the soul, made the lover virtuous, and elevated human feeling closer to divine perfection. It was, in theory, a spiritual exercise. Suffering was sacred. Unfulfilled desire became a kind of prayer. If that sounds exhausting, it was. But it also gave people something the feudal system rarely allowed: an inner life. Amid wars, taxes, and arranged marriages, poetry offered a safe rebellion, a private kingdom where emotion mattered more than property. Outside castle walls, peasants continued to marry for food, shelter, and survival. They likely listened to these poems the way one might listen to a distant radio broadcast from another planet. Still, even they absorbed bits of the ideal. Songs filtered down through fairs and festivals, reshaped into simpler tunes. The idea that love could make you noble even without a title found quiet roots among those who owned nothing but their voices. In taverns, where literacy was optional and exaggeration mandatory, the tales of tragic lovers were retold with more drinking and less chastity. Not everyone agreed on what counted as love. Scholars debated whether passion could exist without sin. Theologians tried to measure affection like wine, defining acceptable doses. Too little, and you were cold. Too much, and you were damned. One monk even wrote that love should be ordered by reason, which is roughly like saying thunderstorms should occur only on schedule. And yet, despite every warning, people kept writing verses, sneaking glances and hiding ribbons. They had discovered something addictive, the pleasure of longing itself. Courtly love gave Europe its first widespread language of emotional excess. It influenced literature for centuries. You can trace its tone in Dante's devotion to Beatrice, in Petrarch's endless sonnets to Laura, in every sighing night who ever rhymed heart with depart. Even Chaucer, the wry English observer, borrowed its irony. He understood that behind all the metaphors and minstrels, people were just trying to dignify the ache of wanting what they couldn't have. Andreas Capellanus ended his treatise with a curious warning. After outlining all the steps of idealized affection, he concluded that real love was impossible within marriage. This line baffled readers then and still raises eyebrows now. What he meant loosely was that everyday companionship lacked the drama that made poetry exciting. Courtly love thrived on distance, misunderstanding, and the risk of ruin. Marriage offered chores, bills, and eventually children. Wonderful, but poor material for verse. To sustain passion, you needed obstacles, preferably ones you could describe in rhyme. The irony, of course, is that this artificial, rule-bound idea of love eventually shaped the modern one. The notion that romance should be pure, transformative, and deeply inconvenient began here, among nobles pretending not to be lonely. It was an emotional theatre with a full cast of yearning hearts, watchful servants, and priests pretending not to notice. It taught people to idolise love, to see it as a ladder from mud to heaven, even when it mostly led to gossip. And so, within those stone halls and candlelit corridors, the idea of romance was reinvented, less as something you did, and more as something you endured. It was a game with no winners, a song that always ended on the same wistful note: love as distance, not possession. Outside, the world still ploughed, baked, and prayed. Inside, someone was writing another verse about eyes like stars and lips like salvation. Humanity, at last, had found a way to make longing fashionable. In that delicate space between devotion and despair, Europe learned to dream in rhyme. And even now, when love songs play on late-night radios or you scroll past declarations online, some small echo of those medieval melodies still hums underneath. The idea that real love is the kind that never quite arrives. After all that candlelit yearning in noble halls, it's time to step outside, into mud, smoke, and the smell of cabbage that has seen better days. For most people in medieval Europe, love was not a poetic hobby. It was a logistical operation. You could sing if you wanted, but you'd probably have to shout over the wind, the livestock, and your mother telling you to fetch water. While the lords wrote poems about unattainable women, peasants wrote survival plans. Their version of romance came with a pitchfork and, if you were lucky, a roof that didn't leak. A medieval peasant's life revolved around work. Endless, repetitive, necessary work. So courtship happened where labour happened. The path to someone's heart was usually the same path to the well, the barn, or the field. Imagine meeting someone not at a feast or dance, but while you're both ankle-deep in mud, chasing a runaway chicken and pretending this counts as flirting. The rhythm of affection followed the rhythm of chores, slow, steady, seasonal. People fell in love between harvests, between prayers, or while sharing a loaf that was mostly rye and regret. Unlike the nobles, peasants couldn't afford subtlety. If you liked someone, you didn't compose poetry. You offered help. You carried firewood for her family or helped repair his roof, or brought a small gift like cheese, ale, or, for the financially ambitious, a goose. Affection had weight and smell. It was practical, edible, and occasionally still alive. There were no serenades under windows because the windows were small, covered in cloth, and led directly into the sleeping area of 4 other people and a goat. Yet within that rough simplicity was something genuine. Marriage among peasants was not a transaction between kingdoms. It was a negotiation between households. 2 families agreeing that survival might be easier together than apart. A man's reputation rested less on poetry and more on his tools, his stamina, and whether his roof was still standing after last winter. A woman's value was measured not by dowry jewels, but by her skill in keeping a household functional when the entire world seemed determined to collapse. Romance, in this context, was a silent partnership forged in exhaustion. The economics of love were visible everywhere. In some regions, a man would pay a small bride price, a modest sum or a few animals, to show he was serious. Elsewhere, the woman's family provided a dowry, maybe a cow, a few linen sheets, or a chest that doubled as a lifetime of storage. These weren't just payments, they were promises. A dowry meant stability, A bride price meant responsibility. Together they formed the medieval version of joint savings. And yet, affection still found its own path. At fairs and village festivals, when the harvest was done and spirits were higher than the quality of ale, young people were allowed to mingle more freely. There were dances, games, and contests that disguised flirting as competition. One popular activity involved young men trying to catch a greased pig. It was noisy, chaotic, and faintly symbolic, chasing something slippery, unlikely to stay still, but rewarding if caught. Medieval romance in one convenient metaphor. Festivals also provided music, food, and occasionally supervised chaos. Parents pretended not to see what their children were doing behind hay bales. The church pretended the games were purely recreational. Everyone knew they weren't. Many marriages began with these festivals, a few shared dances, a few practical gifts, and a quiet word to the priest. Love didn't need fireworks, it needed witnesses and good timing. Courtship customs varied by region, but the rhythm was always familiar. A man might visit the woman's family, offer gifts, and speak formally to her father. If accepted, there might be a betrothal, a promise that carried nearly the same weight as marriage itself. Once agreed, the couple could be seen together more often, though more often usually meant working side by side, not strolling hand in hand through meadows. Work was the meadow. Privacy was rare. Villages were small, houses smaller, and gossip infinite. Every flirtation was a public event, whether you wanted it or not. Neighbours noticed who lingered by whose door, who walked home together, who shared too much laughter at market. Even affection had to pass the communal test of appropriateness. Yet this shared scrutiny also protected people. It kept relationships visible and, in a world without much legal recourse, somewhat accountable. It would be easy to assume such lives were loveless, but that would be wrong. The tenderness of peasant marriages was quieter, more functional, but no less real. Husbands and wives shared long years of weather, illness, and work. They learned each other's habits in detail, how one liked their bread baked, or how the other hummed when worried. These small observations built intimacy in a way poetry never could. Love was maintenance, a constant act of repair, both of walls and of patience. There were moments of humour too. Medieval documents preserve odd glimpses. A husband fined for calling his wife a bag of bones in public. Another punished for refusing to sleep in the same bed during winter. Some villages held charivaries, noisy parades to shame those who broke marriage norms, a community version of relationship feedback. People beat pots and pans outside your house if you married too quickly after widowhood, or if your new spouse was suspiciously younger, or if you'd been unfaithful. Nothing quite says social correction like a midnight concert of kettles. Despite such chaos, love persisted, proving itself adaptable. When famine hit, couples shared the same hunger. When plague swept through, they dug graves together and kept living. In these conditions, affection was an act of endurance. To stay, to care, to keep going. That was romance. It was not the dream of a distant lady on a balcony, but the shared fatigue of survival. You didn't need a poet. You needed someone who would wake before dawn and milk the cow without complaint. The historian in you might notice how every romantic ideal eventually becomes practical. The troubadours glorified suffering from afar, but peasants learned to find beauty in proximity, in the familiar face across the table, in the sound of shared laughter over the same chipped cup. Their love was built, not imagined. It grew like the fields they tended, slowly, season by season, unpredictable, but essential. And perhaps that's why, centuries later, when people speak of true love, they don't always picture palaces or knights. They picture something closer to a small house with a leaking roof, and two people fixing it together, laughing despite the rain. The kind of romance that doesn't make history books, but quietly keeps history going. If the medieval world had a rulebook for affection, monasteries were the chapters written in invisible ink. There, behind thick stone walls and echoing cloisters, love was supposed to vanish. Men and women of faith had taken vows of chastity, silence, and obedience. 3 excellent ways to kill a conversation, and yet somehow not enough to stop human emotion from wandering in through the chapel door. Because even under vows, hearts still had pulse. In theory, monks and nuns were married to God. It was considered a perfect union, free from the distractions of flesh and fortune. In practice, it was a long, quiet relationship punctuated by chanting, gardening, and occasionally envying anyone who got to talk about something other than sin. You might imagine monasteries as solemn, still places where desire couldn't breathe, but in reality, they were full of people who had once lived outside those walls, people who remembered warmth, touch, and the sound of laughter. Some memories don't obey rules. Love inside a monastery was forbidden, but that made it all the more interesting. A passing smile in the cloister, a hand brushing another while copying a manuscript, tiny accidents became events of cosmic significance. The church condemned such feelings as temptation, but the same church filled its art with angels who looked suspiciously like models. It taught that desire was dangerous, yet confessed that it was part of creation. The result was a constant tension between devotion and distraction, between heaven and whatever was happening under the writing desk. Letters were the main battleground. Monks and nuns wrote endlessly, to confess, to preach, to beg for forgiveness, and sometimes to say what they weren't supposed to. The line between a theological reflection and a love letter could be very thin. A monk might write to a nun about the beauty of divine light, but then accidentally describe her eyes. A nun might reply with a treatise on virtue, only to end with a sentence that sounded suspiciously like affection. When found, these letters caused scandal. When not found, they caused poetry. The most famous example comes from the 12th century, the story of Abelard and Eloise. He was a brilliant scholar and philosopher. She was his student, equally gifted, possibly more so. They fell in love, and their letters survive, passionate, intellectual, full of longing and debate. The church read them with horror, students read them with fascination, and centuries later, people still read them for the same reason we read any private message: curiosity disguised as cultural interest. Their affair ended badly, involving secrecy, punishment, and a lifelong reminder that the church took its moral code very seriously. Yet their correspondence became the blueprint for every forbidden romance since. In smaller monasteries, the stories were quieter. Young novices might develop attachments to their mentors. Confessors sometimes fell for the people they were guiding, a particularly inconvenient kind of temptation. Punishments varied: prayer, isolation, or being transferred to another monastery several miles away, which, given medieval transportation, was a fate only slightly better than exile. Still, rumours persisted. Love letters disguised as psalms, small gifts hidden inside devotional books, a pressed flower between pages of scripture, symbols that balance between sin and sweetness. The irony is that writing itself was encouraged. Copying texts, creating illuminated manuscripts, and crafting sermons were all part of holy work. But the same pen that wrote a hymn could easily write a confession of longing. Scholars have found marginal notes in old manuscripts where a bored scribe doodled hearts, small faces, or half-erased lines of verse. You can almost hear the sigh behind the ink. Even holiness, it seems, needed a daydream. Outside monasteries, letters carried a different kind of risk. In towns and villages, written affection was rare because literacy was rare. A love letter had to be dictated to someone else, often a clerk, priest, or professional scribe. That meant your romantic secret passed through at least 2 other people before it reached its destination. Privacy, in short, was a luxury. Imagine having to ask your local priest to compose a delicate note for the person you liked, knowing he'd correct your grammar and your morals at the same time, and if your letter used the wrong phrasing, it could even count as a legal marriage. Words mattered that much. Some people found creative solutions. Messages were delivered through intermediaries, trusted servants, sympathetic friends, or children who couldn't yet read what they were carrying. Tokens accompanied letters, ribbons, rings, a piece of embroidered cloth. Each object said what words could not. In an age when silence was safer than speech, symbolism was the preferred language of love. To hold a token was to hold a secret. Of course, not all letters were romantic. Many were confessions, long, anxious inventories of guilt. Medieval people confessed with enthusiasm. They confessed to lustful thoughts, impure dreams, even to the vague suspicion of enjoying the wrong kind of hymn. Confession was meant to purify, but it also became strangely intimate. To speak your heart to another person in a whispering room was its own kind of emotional exposure. Some confessors became too sympathetic, too understanding. It wasn't unheard of for feelings to develop between penitent and priest, proof that vulnerability is a universal doorway, no matter how many locks theology adds. Behind the discipline and the fear of sin, there was something humanly touching about it all. People weren't trying to rebel. They were simply alive. They loved the wrong people in the wrong places at the wrong time, which is also how most of us learn about love at all. The difference is that their mistakes came with public penance, while ours come with awkward silence and phone notifications. Every institution that tried to control desire ended up preserving it instead. The monasteries gave us not only prayers, but also the first truly personal letters in European history. The emotional vocabulary of later love poetry, devotion, longing, guilt, redemption, was shaped by monks and nuns who couldn't stop writing to each other under the pretense of piety. They turned theology into metaphor and metaphor back into confession. Out of restriction grew the language of feeling, and so the medieval world produced two kinds of love stories, the noble and the forbidden. One was sung by troubadours in public halls, the other whispered behind stone walls where no one was supposed to hear. Both shared the same heartbeat, the desire to speak what cannot safely be spoken. Somewhere in a cold scriptorium a candle burns low, a quill scratches across parchment, and someone is writing "forgive me" when they really mean "remember me." The ink dries, the secret remains. And the sound of the bell outside reminds everyone that devotion and desire have always kept time together. By now, you've seen how medieval people managed to fall in love under the watchful eye of everyone they knew. Priests, parents, and sometimes God himself taking notes. But affection in the Middle Ages didn't just require courage, it required paperwork. Because love, if not properly documented, was not love at all. It was potential litigation. The church, ever helpful, turned marriage into a finely tuned legal instrument. Priests became record keepers, and every union needed proof, verbal, written, and preferably witnessed by half the village. To marry without permission was like setting up a small rebellion in your own house. That's why the church invented the banns, the public announcement that made everyone aware of who was marrying whom. It was a sort of medieval social media post. 3 Sundays in a row, your name echoed across the congregation, accompanied by whispers and badly concealed smirks. The idea was to allow objections, especially those involving close kinship. But mostly, it allowed gossip to flourish like ivy on a church wall. If no one objected by the 3rd Sunday, you could proceed. But if someone did, things got complicated. Objections could include everything from their second cousins to "he already promised himself to my sister," or the very popular "they once held hands too long during Lent." The priest would pause, note the protest, and send the matter to the bishop's court. For something meant to sanctify love, marriage often started like a lawsuit. For the lower classes, most unions were sealed by verbal promise, a simple exchange of words that anyone could overhear. The formula was straightforward: Spoken aloud, usually in front of witnesses, it translated softly to, "I take you as my wife," followed by, "and I take you as my husband." That was enough. The Latin phrasing was sometimes garbled by local dialects, but intent mattered more than pronunciation. Once the words were said, the couple was married in the eyes of God and, more importantly, the neighbours. But intent alone didn't feed families. So came the question of money, or whatever passed for money. A marriage, at any level, was a negotiation between households, often conducted with the seriousness of a land deal. The woman's family offered a dowry, a contribution of goods, animals, or coin meant to secure her stability. The man, in turn, might provide a bride price, a payment to the bride's kin to demonstrate commitment. Together they formed a balance, property leaving one house, responsibility entering another. If love was a fire, the dowry was the wood that kept it burning through winter. Dowries could include anything from land and silver to spoons, linens, or the occasional pig. For wealthier families, they were vast. Estates, vineyards, or whole villages passed between surnames. For peasants, a dowry might be a single cow or a few blankets stitched over long winters. Whatever the scale, these exchanges carried deep symbolic weight. They were more than transactions. They were trust made tangible, and once recorded, they were nearly impossible to undo. Annulments existed, but only for serious reasons. Hidden impotence, proven infidelity, or unfortunate discoveries of kinship that could fill several family trees. The process of preparing for marriage was so complex that professional witnesses emerged, men and women who could testify that vows were spoken correctly. In a world where few could write, testimony was everything. Entire cases depended on who remembered which words, in what order, and under which weather. Church courts were flooded with petitions to clarify, correct, or dissolve unions that had gone wrong. A misplaced word could mean the difference between holy matrimony and local scandal. For many women, the dowry was both liberation and trap. It gave them economic identity, but it also marked their value. Without it, a woman might remain unmarried, dependent on relatives or convent charity. With it, she could enter a household as an equal partner, at least on parchment. But once transferred, her dowry became her husband's responsibility, and recovering it after his death or mismanagement was another matter entirely. Love, like any investment, came with risk. Families took the process seriously. Negotiations could last months, even years. Parents calculated the social and financial advantages. A marriage might unite fields, settle disputes, or climb one notch up the ladder of feudal respectability. Personal affection, if it existed, was a fortunate side effect. If it didn't, well, the couple could always learn to like each other later. Medieval philosophy treated love as something that followed duty, not the other way around. It was expected to arrive eventually, like spring after a particularly grim winter. Among the nobility, the contracts became even grander. Whole alliances were sealed by marriages between houses that barely shared a language. A prince in one kingdom might marry a duchess from another, to avoid a war or to start one under better management. In such unions, love was decorative, mentioned politely at banquets, ignored at strategy meetings. The church blessed them all, provided the paperwork was immaculate and the dowries impressive. A bishop's signature on a marriage contract was as good as an army. For commoners, the ceremony was simpler but still serious. The wedding took place at the church door, not inside. There, in front of everyone, the couple spoke their vows. The priest blessed them, the community watched, and coins might be tossed for luck. Afterwards came feasting, ale, and dancing, the only part where anyone truly relaxed. The church tolerated these celebrations as long as they stayed near decency, which they rarely did. Someone always drank too much, someone always danced too enthusiastically, and someone always declared loudly that marriage was a fine idea until it happened to you. Despite all the formality, the emotion was real. The couple stood together, nervous, hopeful, aware that from that moment their lives were joined not just in faith, but in property, work, and fate. They had signed no parchment, but the village itself became the archive. Every neighbour remembered who said what and when. Love had witnesses, hundreds of them, all slightly drunk, all ready to tell the story for decades. The church, proud of its structure, saw this as order. God's will, they said, worked best when properly notarized. Yet within the rules, humanity still slipped through. A shared glance during vows, a laugh during the feast, a moment of awkward joy. Even bureaucracy couldn't erase the small miracles of emotion. People found ways to mean what they said, even when the words were prescribed. And so, the medieval marriage stood as both contract and covenant, half business deal, half act of faith. It promised permanence in a world full of plague and uncertainty. It gave love a ledger and hope a witness. Behind the Latin phrases and the clinking of coins was something older than law, the quiet, reckless courage to say yes when the world was listening. For a society that trusted God with everything, medieval people still spent an extraordinary amount of time looking for signs. They prayed for divine guidance, of course, but they also watched the sky, the wind, and even the behaviour of small animals, just in case God preferred to communicate through local weather or poultry. Love was no exception. The heart might have been spiritual, but its timing, they believed, could be adjusted by the planets. Astrology wasn't a fringe superstition. It was considered a science, respectable enough for kings and monks to study. Learned men drew charts that mapped the heavens and, by extension, the likelihood that your marriage would prosper or end in polite disaster. Each planet carried its own personality. Venus governed affection, Mars oversaw passion, Saturn handled gloom and delay, and Jupiter offered the occasional stroke of luck. A favourable alignment could mean a happy match. A bad one could mean your spouse would snore, squander money, or, worse, move in with their in-laws. The church tried to disapprove. Officially, Christians were supposed to trust providence, not planetary gossip. Yet many priests quietly kept almanacs in their studies. It was difficult to condemn astrology when so many church towers doubled as observatories. Even theologians found the metaphor irresistible. The stars as divine handwriting, the sky as a manuscript of destiny. If you couldn't read Latin, you could at least learn to interpret Orion. Among common folk, omens were the poor man's astrology. The universe was full of signals, and ignoring them was asking for trouble. If you dropped your bread butter side down, a quarrel was coming. If a cat sneezed near your doorstep, someone in the household would soon fall in love, or fall ill, depending on the cat. Meeting a monk on your way to propose was unlucky, but meeting two was worse, since that counted as confirmation. And if you tripped walking to the church, it was unclear whether it meant lifelong happiness or a hint that you should reconsider. Rural communities took these signs seriously. Old women, called wise wives, served as unofficial advisors on love and health. They brewed herbs for courage, tied protective ribbons to ward off jealousy, and read fortunes by candle flame. Their methods mixed Christian prayers with much older charms. Some whispered verses that sounded suspiciously pagan. Others swore by saints' relics for extra legitimacy. It was a delicate balance between faith and folklore, like seasoning your theology with a pinch of superstition. Astrology also crept into matchmaking. Certain days were considered unlucky for weddings. Fridays, for instance, because that was the day of the crucifixion. Marrying in May was risky since it coincided with pagan fertility festivals, which the church had tried to rename but never quite tamed. The safest season was late winter, when nothing much could go wrong except the weather, and your fingers freezing during the ceremony. Even so, people checked the moon's phase before setting a date. A waxing moon meant growth and prosperity. A waning one meant slow decline. Or as one chronicler wrote with cheerful pessimism, a marriage whose joys do shortly diminish. Objects carried meaning too. Lovers exchanged small charms, rings, gloves, locks of hair. The placement of these gifts mattered. A glove tied to a sleeve could signal commitment. A glove dropped at the wrong time could signal betrothal by accident. One story tells of a young woman who lent her ribbon to a knight for a tournament and later discovered she was legally considered engaged. She hadn't meant to say yes, but symbolism had its own authority. In medieval logic, the body spoke a language the mouth couldn't always correct. Even dreams could dictate fate. Dreaming of fire meant passion. Dreaming of water meant tears. Dreaming of a church meant marriage approaching, though some said it only meant rain. Books of dreams circulated widely, filled with interpretations so detailed that nearly every possible combination of livestock and weather had a romantic consequence. A rooster crowing before dawn, new love, a cow looking at you twice, betrayal. The line between prophecy and parody was thin, but few risked testing it. If the world wanted to send you messages, it seemed rude not to listen. Occasionally, superstition and church collided spectacularly. In one case from an English parish, a couple was accused of using a love charm made from consecrated bread. They claimed it wasn't witchcraft, just enhanced devotion. The bishop disagreed, and their trial ended with many prayers and a public reminder that holy objects were not meant to double as dating accessories. Yet beneath the laughter, such stories reveal a universal truth. People wanted certainty. In a world ruled by famine and fate, it was comforting to believe that love at least followed rules, even if they were written in starlight and animal behaviour. Astrology even shaped how people viewed personality. Medieval thinkers, borrowing from ancient Greek medicine, believed in 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, each ruled by a planet and determining temperament. The cheerful were sanguine, governed by air and the warmth of spring. The calm were phlegmatic, linked to water. The fiery were choleric, under summer's sun, and the moody, melancholic, belonged to autumn's shadow. Compatibility, then, wasn't about shared hobbies. It was about matching your fluids. A choleric man was better suited to a phlegmatic wife, balance being the goal. You didn't need chemistry, you needed biology, politely simplified. Today, the idea of choosing a partner based on humours or constellations might seem quaint, but for medieval people, it gave structure to uncertainty. Love was unpredictable, yes, but not entirely lawless. If the moon could move the tides, surely it could nudge the heart. And if a few herbs or whispered verses helped along the way, well, who was really harmed? Faith and superstition were not opposites. They were partners in a cosmic marriage of their own. When you imagine a medieval couple standing before the altar, remember, they arrived there after consulting the sky, the neighbours, and probably a few chickens. They listened for omens, sought divine permission, and checked for planetary approval. By the time the priest began his blessing, half the universe had already weighed in. Love, in that sense, was truly communal, shared between heaven, earth, and everyone in between. And perhaps that's what makes their world strangely familiar. We too still look for signs, the timing of a message, the coincidence of a song, the alignment of moods instead of stars. We want to believe the universe cares about our happiness, that it whispers guidance through patterns only we can notice. The difference is that we call it intuition instead of astrology. But deep down, it's the same ancient habit, the hope that fate is secretly on our side. After the vows were spoken, the coins exchanged, and the ale properly spilled, the medieval couple finally began what everyone assumed was the easy part: married life. In theory, this was the reward for all the fasting, praying, and paperwork. In practice, it was another kind of devotion, one that demanded endurance instead of excitement. Marriage, as the priest reminded everyone, was a sacred bond, But in daily life, it was also an unpaid partnership held together by habit, faith, and the absence of alternatives. Divorce did not exist in the modern sense. The church allowed for annulment, but only if the marriage had never truly existed in spirit or in law. The acceptable reasons were few. One partner had been forced, too young, already married, or incapable of consummation. To prove that last one, by the way, required testimony. An ordeal so humiliating that many couples decided to simply stay together and argue in peace. Separation could be granted in extreme cases, usually involving violence or abandonment, but remarriage was nearly impossible. The phrase, "till death do us part," was not poetic, it was policy. That's why affection within marriage had to evolve. After the wedding feast ended and the hangovers cleared, what remained was a shared life of relentless work. The couple ran a household, raised children, and prayed for good harvests. They slept side by side in the same narrow bed, often with a child or two at their feet, and sometimes with chickens underneath. Privacy was a luxury. Romance was expressed through small acts of care, mending clothes, sharing bread, leaving the better blanket for the other. If a husband fetched water for his wife, or a wife saved her husband the last piece of cheese, it was considered a grand gesture. In a life of scarcity, kindness carried more weight than poetry. It wasn't all tenderness, of course. Marital quarrels were public sport. Everyone knew everyone else's arguments, and sometimes joined in. A wife might complain to her neighbours about her husband's laziness. A husband might grumble about his wife's spending habits, which usually involved an extra chicken or a piece of fabric from market. Local courts recorded endless disputes. Men fined for insults, women fined for striking their husbands with cooking tools. One document from 14th century England notes a husband who dragged his wife by the hair to church as proof of his authority. The court disagreed and fined him for disturbing the peace. Medieval law may not have offered equality, but it occasionally offered irony. Adultery existed, of course, and it was complicated. For men, it was a sin but often forgiven. For women, it could destroy everything. The church viewed female fidelity as the foundation of social order, a comforting notion for men, less so for women. Yet despite the danger, affairs happened. They were whispered about, investigated, and occasionally punished with public penance. Some were purely emotional, echoing the ideals of courtly love. Others were pragmatic, born from loneliness in marriages arranged for property. The tension between passion and propriety never vanished. It merely changed clothes and pretended to pray more often. For the clergy, such matters provided endless moral examples. Sermons warned husbands to cherish their wives and wives to obey their husbands. The roles were clear. Men ruled, women managed. But within that framework, many marriages found their own balance. A capable wife might effectively run the household and the finances, while her husband handled the plough and the parish gossip. Together they became co-authors of survival. Love wasn't about grand declarations, it was about synchronized exhaustion. Widowhood changed the rules. When a husband died, his widow faced two simultaneous truths: grief and opportunity. For the first time, she controlled her own property, even if only temporarily. Some women remarried quickly for security, others didn't, enjoying rare independence. Medieval society noticed. A widow with money and no supervision was considered both enviable and alarming, proof that freedom could exist inside a system that denied it to almost everyone else. Jokes circulated about merry widows who mourned briefly and negotiated briskly. The humour was nervous, because a self-sufficient woman was always a challenge to order. Men widowed by death often remarried even faster. They needed practical help, someone to cook, clean, and keep the household running. Love was secondary to logistics. Records show men remarrying within months, sometimes weeks, of a spouse's burial. The church disapproved of haste but recognised necessity. Mourning was holy, but so was feeding your children. In many ways, the rhythm of remarriage kept communities functioning, a quiet recycling of stability. There was also the matter of children. Large families were blessings and burdens. Mortality was high, so people aimed for numbers. Parenting was communal. Neighbours, godparents, and older siblings all helped. Amid the noise and need, romantic affection often hid beneath parental duty. A husband and wife might not say, "I love you," but they showed it by keeping the family alive through famine and plague. It was love measured by endurance, the slow devotion of two people who refused to quit. Still, the heart remained unpredictable. Some couples, after years of shared hardship, grew genuinely close. Letters from widows reveal affection so deep it surprises modern readers. Women describing their husbands as "my truest friend," or "the other half of my labour." Others, equally honest, confessed relief at being free. The range of feeling was as wide as any age. The difference is that they didn't separate easily. They stayed, patched things up, and kept working. Love wasn't something you fell into. It was something you built, brick by muddy brick. Public morality tried to regulate even the private happiness of marriage. Towns staged charivaris, noisy parades of pots and pans, to shame couples who broke unwritten rules. Too young, too old, remarried too fast, or simply disliked by neighbours, anyone could find themselves serenaded by cookware. It was community feedback, medieval style. You could ignore it, but you couldn't sleep through it. These rituals might seem cruel, yet they reinforced shared values: fidelity, respect, and a faintly comedic belief that banging metal could fix ethics. Despite all the scrutiny, affection persisted. The longer couples stayed together, the less they cared about perfection. They learned patience, forgiveness, and the art of selective hearing. And somewhere amid the chores and quarrels, genuine companionship grew. The quiet knowledge that, for better or worse, this person had chosen to keep facing life beside you. That was no small thing. In time, every marriage became a story told by others, how they met, how they fought, how they endured. Some were remembered for laughter, others for tragedy, but most for the simple fact that they stayed. Stability was love's final language. It didn't need verses or witnesses anymore. Only the daily act of staying put when leaving would have been easier. So when you picture a medieval couple, bent by age, sitting beside a small fire surrounded by children and the noise of a working home, imagine that under the soot and the silence there was tenderness. Not the dramatic kind that writes poetry, but the kind that cooks supper, chops wood, and remembers to close the shutters against the cold. The kind of love that doesn't sparkle but glows quietly, like embers that refuse to die out. After wandering through the narrow lanes of medieval love, where feelings were supervised and happiness came with witnesses, it feels natural to look further back, to a world where the stakes of affection were far larger. Before Europe built cathedrals and legal contracts for marriage, the ancient steppes stretched wide and windswept, home to people who valued freedom more than ceremony. Among them lived a queen who would one day teach an empire what happens when love is used as a weapon. Her name was Tomyris, and she ruled the Massagetæ, a nomadic people east of the Caspian Sea. Her story, told by the Greek historian Herodotus, begins with a proposal, not of romance, but of conquest disguised as affection. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire, had already conquered half the known world. He was a man who collected territories the way others collected dinner plates. When his armies reached the edge of the steppe, they found the Massagetæ. Horsemen and women who lived without walls, moved with the seasons and bowed to no one. Cyrus, perhaps tired of constant warfare, or perhaps amused by the challenge, sent an offer of peace. He proposed marriage to Queen Tomyris, suggesting that together they could unite their kingdoms, rule side by side, and presumably live in regal harmony. It sounded noble. It also sounded like every other empire's introduction before invasion. Tomyris was not fooled. She saw the offer for what it was, a velvet glove hiding a blade. In polite but firm terms, she refused. If Cyrus wanted her land, he could try taking it the usual way, with spears, not vows. Her rejection was more than personal. It was political defiance, a refusal to turn sovereignty into dowry. In the calm of her tent beneath the endless sky, she sent back word that she would not be conquered through flattery or faith. And thus began one of history's strangest courtships, an empire attempting seduction and a queen replying with war. Cyrus decided to proceed with what we might call Plan B, also known as invasion. He crossed the river that separated their lands, expecting quick victory. The steppe, however, had its own ideas. The Massagetæ were expert riders, born in motion, their tactics fluid as wind. The Persians built walls, the nomads built distance. For days the armies watched each other from opposite horizons. Then Cyrus tried a trick, a banquet trap. He left a camp filled with food and wine, knowing that the nomads, unused to such luxury, might indulge. They did. Tomyris' son, leading part of the army, captured the camp and celebrated. Drunk and unguarded, he was ambushed. The Persians slaughtered his men and took him prisoner. When Tomyris heard the news, she didn't weep. Herodotus says she sent Cyrus a message: release her son, fight openly, or she would drown him in blood. Cyrus ignored her. Her son, shamed and desolate, took his own life in captivity. What followed was a battle that outlasted every poem about heroism. The Massagetæ struck with precision and fury, their arrows darkening the daylight. By evening, the Persian army lay destroyed, and Cyrus, the man who had conquered kings, was among the dead. Tomyris found his body. According to legend, she ordered his head severed and dropped into a wineskin filled with human blood. You wanted blood, she said, and now you have your fill. Whether she spoke those words or whether a storyteller added them later hardly matters. The image remained, a queen, calm and unflinching, giving the most brutal answer to the most dangerous proposal in history. To later generations, the act seemed shocking, almost mythic. But within its harsh poetry lay something simple: justice. On the steppe, honour was not ornamental, it was survival. To betray trust or to disguise greed as love was the greatest sin. Tomyris defended her people not out of vengeance but out of principle, the same kind that guided any community that refused to be absorbed. In that sense, her defiance was not cruelty but clarity. The nomadic world she represented understood love differently. It was not a bond sealed by priests or kings, but by shared motion and mutual respect. A husband and wife might ride side by side into battle. A family was defined not by property, but by the willingness to move together when the seasons changed. In such a world, affection meant partnership, not possession. Cyrus had offered her the latter, and she returned the favour, rather literally. Herodotus's version of events, written by a man who had never seen the steppe, carries the perfume of legend. He describes Tomyris as fierce, magnificent, almost divine. Artists later painted her as the avenging mother, standing over the fallen emperor, her hands steady, her gaze unshaken. Renaissance painters turned the scene into allegory, virtue triumphing over pride, the eternal warning against confusing conquest with affection. In some versions, she looks sorrowful, as if the victory had cost her something larger than war. Maybe it did. Her story is less about revenge than about the price of autonomy, what it costs to say no when the world expects you to say yes. Through centuries, Tomyris became a symbol in many cultures. For Persians, she was a tragic foe. For Central Asians, a hero of independence. For Europeans, a convenient moral fable. In modern retellings, she appears again and again as the woman who outsmarted empire, the queen who refused to trade love for freedom. Some nations still claim her as an ancestor of spirit, a reminder that leadership can wear armour without losing tenderness. Her story, when told softly, feels almost like a folk tale told by firelight. You can picture the tents spread across the plain, the horses grazing under a red sky, the sound of wind rolling through the grass like distant drums. In that quiet vastness, Tomyris becomes less a warrior and more a voice. The echo of every woman who chose principle over persuasion, every leader who understood that peace built on deceit is just a longer war. Compared to the narrow stone rooms of medieval Europe, her steppe world was all openness. The air itself was liberty. And perhaps that's why her legend endures, because she reminds us that love, when forced, ceases to be love at all. It becomes another word for control. Tomyris didn't fight because she hated. She fought because she refused to let affection be weaponized. In that sense, she was centuries ahead of her time, and as history tends to prove, entirely right. The Persians buried Cyrus with honour. The world moved on. But the image of Tomyris standing tall against empire never faded. She left behind no marble statue, no written decree, only a story that travelled farther than any soldier. And in that story lies a question older than marriage itself. What is the value of love if it demands the surrender of who you are? If Queen Tomyris proved that one woman could stand against an empire, the steppe itself proved she was never alone. Across centuries and horizons, women of the nomadic world left their stories buried in earth and iron. They did not wait to be rescued, painted, or remembered. They rode, fought, traded, and ruled, often at the same time, which was efficient if exhausting. And when archaeologists began to open their graves thousands of years later, they found something unexpected: equality, written not in parchment, but in bone. In the southern steppes of what is now Kazakhstan, tombs of the Scythians, fierce horse archers who ranged between the Black Sea and Siberia, began to yield surprising finds. Inside the burial mounds, known as kurgans, lay women interred with bows, arrows, spears, and even war horses. Their bones showed the same calluses as men's, marks from riding and pulling a bow. One skeleton, estimated to be 16, had been buried in full armour, her fingers curved as if still gripping a weapon. For centuries these finds were dismissed as symbolic, perhaps ceremonial wives buried with their husbands' equipment. But repetition makes argument. There were too many weapons and too few husbands. The simplest explanation was the truest one. These women had fought. To the Scythians, this wasn't scandalous, it was sensible. Nomadic life blurred boundaries. When survival depends on mobility, everyone must be capable. A woman who could defend the herd, scout terrain, or negotiate a truce was as valuable as any man. Ability mattered more than hierarchy. Gender was a detail, not a destiny. You could ride, shoot, and lead, or you could perish. It was that straightforward. The Greeks, ever fond of labelling what they didn't understand, called them Amazons. To Greek poets, women warriors were paradoxes, both alluring and alarming. They placed them in myths, on the edges of civilization, in lands where logic surrendered to legend. Yet those legends had roots in reality. The Greeks had met Scythian archers in battle, and the memory stuck. When later excavations revealed female skeletons with arrowheads lodged in ribs, the myth and the evidence quietly shook hands. The Amazons, it turned out, were never fantasy. They were field reports retold as warning tales. Tomyris was one face of this pattern, but the same spirit rode elsewhere too. In distant Britain, centuries later, Boudica led her tribe against Roman occupation, setting cities ablaze in a campaign that terrified the empire before ending in tragedy. In Syria, Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, challenged Rome again. An intellectual and a general, fluent in several languages, unstoppable until her capture. In Greece, Artemisia of Halicarnassus commanded warships for Xerxes and survived to advise him afterward. History keeps describing these women as exceptions, yet taken together, they begin to look suspiciously like a tradition. Even in the Mongol world centuries later, the same pattern persisted. Wives, mothers, and daughters of Khans managed vast trade networks, negotiated alliances, and led troops when necessary. One chronicler described an empress riding into battle in her husband's armour, her hair braided under the helmet. When someone remarked that she fought like a man, another replied, "No, she fights like herself." It was the closest thing to equality that the pre-modern world had achieved, and it came not from law but from landscape. The steppe had no patience for delicate hierarchy. Survival erased etiquette. The mobility of nomadic life demanded competence in everything. Children learned to ride before they could walk steadily. Women managed herds, chose campsites, and trained with bows. The rhythm of daily life, mounting, dismounting, packing tents, crossing rivers, left a little room for the notion of frailty. And in that pragmatic equality lay a quiet kind of freedom. You were valued for what you could do, not what you were supposed to be. Still, their lives were not simple. Freedom came with its own fatigue. Constant movement meant constant vigilance. Wars with neighbouring tribes or empires could erupt overnight. Some women became legends, others vanished unnamed into the plains. The steppe remembers few details, but it remembers patterns. The curve of hoof prints, the faint imprint of a saddle, the arrowheads scattered like punctuation across the soil. Later, historians writing from stone cities tried to categorize these people. They called them barbarians or nomads, depending on whether they feared or admired them. They wrote of women riding to battle like men, missing the point entirely. On the steppe, everyone rode like a steppe dweller. Chivalry, that courtly European invention that placed women on pedestals and then scolded them for moving, never reached this far east. As one might dryly observe, chivalry worked differently when everyone had a horse. It's strange to imagine how different their world felt. The sound of wind across miles of open grass, the constant creak of leather and wood, the smell of fur cloaks and iron dust. There were no castles, no stained glass, no rigid walls dividing male and female duties. There was only horizon. Freedom in such a place was both intoxicating and terrifying. To live meant to travel, and to love meant to share that journey. The family tent was not a private home. It was a moving partnership. When archaeologists sift through these graves today, they find not only weapons but also jewellery, mirrors and combs, objects of beauty beside tools of war. The combination unsettled earlier scholars, who preferred their categories neat. But for the Scythians, beauty and strength were not opposites. They were simply parts of being whole. To braid your hair before battle, to polish your bowstring, to wear bright beads into the storm. These were acts of identity, not vanity. The world eventually moved on, empires grew, borders hardened, and sedentary civilizations rewrote the stories. The warrior women of the steppe became myths again, filed away under legend instead of memory. But bones don't lie, and iron doesn't fade. Every new excavation reopens the conversation, reminding us that history, like the sky, is broader than the walls we build around it. And so, when you picture the ancient steppe at dusk, a small caravan disappearing into endless gold, the sound of hooves rolling like distant thunder, remember that some of the riders were women, armoured in fur and resolve. Their names may have been lost, but their motion remains. They remind us that courage, once unbound, doesn't vanish. It just changes saddles. By the time the riders dismounted and the fires were lit, the steppe transformed. The open world of movement shrank into circles of warmth and shadow. Horses snorted softly in the dark, their silhouettes drifting like ghosts around the camp. Within those circles, a different kind of power ruled, the power of memory. This was the steppe's library, a handful of elders, a few bright flames, and voices that could hold centuries without a single written word. Nomadic people did not build archives or carve laws into stone. They carried them in their heads. The law was not a tablet, it was a story. Every night, when the wind dropped and the stars emerged, someone began to speak. The words were measured, rhythmic, half poetry, half record. Elders recited the codes of the clan, who owed whom, what could be traded, which oaths were sacred, and how disputes should be settled. A child might fall asleep hearing the same verses repeated night after night until the cadence was part of their bones. Forgetfulness was not just impolite, it was dangerous. A broken memory could mean a broken agreement and on the steppe that could start a war. Each tribe had its keepers of wisdom, people who remembered the stories, songs and laws. Some were old men whose hair shimmered like frost. Others were women whose voices could silence an entire camp with a single line. They remembered not only rules but origins, where the tribe had come from, who their ancestors had been, and which river crossings had claimed the most lives. These tales gave shape to a world without borders. To forget them was to lose direction, literally and spiritually. There were no maps in the steppe, only memory. A stranger from a city might have seen chaos, people without writing, without archives, without parchment. But listen longer, and you would hear precision. Oral law, for all its apparent fragility, was astonishingly exact. A wrong word could change the meaning, so every teller guarded each syllable. The rhythm acted as an anchor, keeping phrases steady through generations. A law might sound like a song, but its melody was practical. It helped people remember, and it helped them obey. Marriage, trade, revenge, hospitality, all had their verses. A promise made in front of witnesses could be sung aloud and therefore preserved. Songs travelled faster than horses. They moved between tribes, binding them through shared rhythm. If a chieftain died, his deeds were recited by those who loved him and those who didn't, ensuring that both praise and warning survived together. Memory was justice, fire was the witness, and the night itself served as parchment. It's tempting to think of these communities as primitive, but they had a kind of efficiency that cities lacked. In towns, laws were written, then forgotten in archives. On the steppe, they were lived. They had to be. Every rule had a melody, every punishment a proverb. It was governance set to music, policy that could be hummed. Scholars later compared this oral tradition to a living book. The nomads, of course, would have simply called it knowing what not to do. Around those fires, history and legend often blended. The tale of an ancient battle might shift over centuries into a cautionary fable. The story of a wise ruler might gather supernatural glow. But within the exaggeration, the truths remained. Loyalty mattered, cowardice lingered, greed poisoned. Myths were not lies. They were memory wrapped in rhythm. They made ethics easier to recall and therefore harder to ignore. And then there were the love stories. Every culture needs them. For the nomads, love tales were rarely tragic. They were instructive. They taught patience, faith, and the art of staying kind while carrying a sword. One popular tale spoke of two riders separated by distance but united by wind. Each night they whistled the same tune so the air would carry their devotion. It's an improbable story, yet somehow believable in a world where sound travelled farther than letters. In another story, a woman tests her, suit her by asking him to follow her footprints across snow for 3 days. When he arrives, frozen and exhausted, she agrees to marry him, not for his endurance, but because he respected the trail. Love, for these people, was never about ownership. It was about endurance and recognition. When the fire crackled low and the stars tilted toward dawn, the voices would quiet. The youngest listener would be chosen to repeat what they had heard, line by line, until the elders nodded in approval. Only then could everyone sleep. This nightly rehearsal kept the culture alive. Writing might preserve words, but repetition preserved identity. In the morning, the laws would ride again, invisible, internal, guiding each action. If a horse was stolen, the verses prescribed restitution, another horse of equal strength plus public apology. If someone broke a promise, they had to sing their own failure aloud before the camp, an act that hurt worse than any fine. Reputation was currency, and memory was the bank. Even outsiders who joined the nomads soon learned the rules by sound. Traders from Persia or China, if they stayed long enough, could hum the tunes that settled disputes. There was elegance in the system, portable justice, travelling with the people it served. No library could burn, no decree could be lost in flood. The archive moved wherever the tribe did. You might imagine these nights as purely solemn, but they were not. Between the laws and legends came laughter, jokes about foolish warriors, mischievous spirits, and unlucky horses. Humour kept the system humane, and sometimes, after all the laws were spoken, someone would murmur a story of love or longing, or an ancestor who once chased a star too far north. The line between rule and dream blurred pleasantly. After all, what was a law but a story everyone agreed to remember? Centuries later, when the steppe people began to settle, many of these songs were written down. But the written versions feel different. Fixed, silent, missing the warmth of voice. You can almost sense the absence of breath, the stillness of words that used to move. Paper preserved them, but it also froze them. The old storytellers might have smiled at this irony. The moment you trap a song, it stops being alive. If you listen carefully on some windy night, far from the noise of cities, you might still catch the echo of those fires, a faint cadence rising and falling like hooves over grass. It's the sound of memory doing what paper never could, staying warm. By dawn, the fire had died down, leaving only thin trails of smoke curling into the blue. The camp stirred to life in low murmurs, hooves shifting, pots clanking, children chasing the last warmth from the embers. On the steppe there were no church bells, no temples, no walls. Faith lived in motion. You could pray anywhere, because the divine was everywhere. The sky was the cathedral, the horizon its altar, and the wind the only choir that never missed a note. The nomadic peoples of Central Asia followed a belief that Europeans would later call Tengrism, a word drawn softly from Tengri, meaning the great sky, the eternal one above all. It was not a god with a beard or a book, but a presence, vast, unbound, impossible to contain. Tengri was the endless blue, the giver of life and the watcher of promises. You did not visit him, you lived under him. Every breath, every hoofbeat, every shadow across the grass was a kind of silent prayer. It was a religion made for travellers, portable and light as wind. This faith wove together heaven, earth, and the spirits between. Beneath the sky was Ej, the Mother Earth, fertile and patient, and within the air moved countless ancestors who lingered as unseen guests. People offered milk to the fire at dawn, sprinkling it to thank the spirits for survival. The act was small but meaningful, a daily renewal of harmony between living and unseen worlds. There were no commandments written on stone tablets. The laws were lived. Respect your kin, honour the land, ride gently on what feeds you, and keep your word even when no one hears it. In a landscape without walls, reputation was the only relic. Religious roles were shared, but the heart of ritual often beat in women's hands. Shamans, or Kam as some tribes called them, could be men or women, yet women were particularly known for their vision. They healed, mediated disputes, guided births, and read dreams. Wrapped in fur and bronze charms, they drummed rhythms that bridged the seen and the unseen. The sound wasn't music exactly, it was a reminder. Each pulse echoed the horse's gait, the heartbeat of the world itself. When they danced, bells sewn into their garments rang softly, a language of sound older than writing. In these ceremonies, power did not mean dominance, it meant connection. The shaman's trance was a journey across mountains of spirit, through clouds of memory, a journey that mirrored the physical life of constant migration. To move was sacred. To stop for too long was to risk forgetting how to listen. That belief shaped everything, even love. To love someone was to move with them, to share their direction. If one rider slowed, the other matched pace. Affection was mobility made human. Outsiders later described this world as pagan or primitive, yet its simplicity concealed sophistication. The steppe faith lacked hierarchy but not depth. The sky, the earth, and fire formed a triangle of balance, each point vital, none superior. Even gender fit within this harmony. Men rode to hunt and guard, women tended, healed, and mediated. But the borders blurred. A woman could fight, a man could weep, a shaman could cross both worlds without scandal. The fluidity startled sedentary societies, where identity came from titles and property. On the steppe, it came from participation. To contribute was to belong. The same fluidity applied to leadership. Queens, mothers, sisters, all could rule if they had the will. In Mongol chronicles, you find women negotiating treaties, commanding armies, or managing vast networks of trade. When men rode to war, it was the women who governed the camps and caravans. They distributed food, managed livestock, and kept the rhythm of life steady. Their power was not granted, it was assumed. The horizon did not discriminate, and neither did necessity. There was also tenderness in this openness. Because no one owned the land, gratitude replaced entitlement. Travellers left gifts at sacred places, a strip of cloth tied to a tree, a cup of milk poured into soil. You didn't pray for wealth or victory. You prayed for balance, for safe passage, for wind at your back. Faith wasn't about demanding miracles. It was about noticing that existence itself already was one. It taught humility, the kind born from standing under a sky too large to measure. Imagine a dawn on that plain, frost glittering on grass, your horse's breath rising like smoke, the world perfectly still except for the sound of bells hanging from the harness. Somewhere, a shaman begins to drum, the sound low and steady. Around you, others join, voices rising softly, blending into the wind. No sermon, no scripture, just a pulse. In that moment, belief is not an idea, it is an atmosphere. What fascinated later historians was how such a vast faith left so little behind. No temples, no monuments, no relics that could be displayed in glass. To them, it looked like absence, but perhaps that was the point. The steppe people built nothing permanent because permanence was an illusion. A stone temple could crumble, a sky could not. Their sacred space was infinite, their worship renewable every morning. When storms erased the tracks of yesterday's camp, the world was made clean again. Forgiveness was built into the landscape. The nomads understood what civilizations often forget. Movement is not the enemy of meaning. Stillness is not proof of truth. For them, holiness was like wind, invisible, necessary, and impossible to own. Their prayers did not echo from walls. They drifted upward, merging with clouds. And in that upward drift lived a philosophy of acceptance. You can't hold the wind, but you can travel with it. Even now, traces of that faith survive in gestures. Travellers in Central Asia still leave bits of blue cloth on mountaintops, offerings to the sky. They still greet the morning sun with a nod, as if acknowledging an old companion. These small rituals, barely changed in 1,000 years, carry the echo of a time when belief required no proof and worship required no translation. If the medieval European world we left behind was ruled by churches and contracts, and the world we are approaching will soon be ruled by machines and timetables, then this moment on the steppe stands between them, a pause in the human story. Here, Love, law, and spirit share the same rhythm, the steady beat of hooves across open earth, and when those riders disappear over the horizon, they leave no ruins, only wind. Yet that somehow feels more eternal than stone. For most of history, distance had been a kind of mercy. The world moved at the speed of muscle, horses' feet, wind in the sails. Journeys stretched across weeks, sometimes months, and no one expected otherwise. Messages aged as they travelled. Lovers waited through seasons. Nations took years to meet themselves. But in the middle of the 19th century, humanity began to grow restless. We decided we'd waited long enough. And so, the Earth was quietly rewired for speed. The story began, as revolutions often do, with a law and a promise. In the year 1862, the United States government passed what it called the Pacific Railway Act, a document so dry in its language that few could guess how violently it would change time itself. It declared that a railroad would be built to unite the Atlantic and the Pacific, two oceans stitched together by steel. Private companies were given land, money, and ambition. In return, they would lay the rails that would make the continent smaller. It was a dream of motion, wrapped in patriotism and profit. Newspapers called it progress. Preachers called it destiny. Investors called it a bargain. Each mile of track was funded by government loans, so companies raced to build as much as possible as fast as possible. One line, the Union Pacific, began in the east. The other, the Central Pacific, began in the west, cutting through mountains and snowdrifts that had previously laughed at human plans. They would meet somewhere in the middle, ideally without collapsing first. Building it was less a construction project than a continental argument with nature. There were mountains to drill, deserts to cross, and bridges to conjure over canyons that did not ask to be crossed. Explosives were used generously, though not always wisely. Chinese labourers hung from ropes on cliffs, hammering holes into granite for black powder charges. Snow-buried camps for months. Avalanches erased progress overnight. In the east, Irish workers battled heat, illness, and raids along the frontier. The pay was low, the work constant, and the sense of purpose often theoretical. Each camp was a small moving city of noise, picks, hammers, curses, and the rhythmic thud of tamped gravel. The sound was hypnotic, mechanical, strangely hopeful. Workers sang as they laid the ties, songs that mixed languages and accents, until meaning gave way to rhythm. "Another mile," someone would shout, and the chant would rise again, equal parts prayer and profanity. The railroad was building them as much as they were building it. When the two lines finally met in 1869 at a place called Promontory Summit, the event was treated as a holy day. A golden spike was hammered into the final tie, connecting the coasts by iron nerve. Telegraph wires carried the news instantly across the country. One tap of the hammer, one electric signal, and the world heard the word done. It was the first moment in history when sound outran the body. The continent held its breath, then exhaled in steam. Beneath the celebration, however, lingered shadows. Many who built the railroad were absent from the famous photograph. The Chinese crews who had blasted through the Sierra Nevada, the freedmen who had laid ties in the plains, the native scouts who had guided and sometimes resisted. Progress, as always, chose its own witnesses. The camera captured smiles and handshakes, but not the frostbite, the deaths, or the wages that disappeared before payday. History, like industry, edits quickly. Still, it was impossible to deny the wonder of what had been made. A trip that once took 6 months by wagon could now be done in a week. Letters crossed the continent faster than gossip could keep up. The railway created time zones, dividing the day into segments so trains wouldn't collide. Before the tracks, noon was whatever moment the sun stood above your town. After the tracks, noon was scheduled. Time, like space, had been standardized. For a world raised on patience, this new rhythm was intoxicating. The whistle of the train became the heartbeat of modern life, steady, relentless, unstoppable. Cities grew along the tracks like iron blossoms. Merchants, miners, and dreamers followed. You could be poor in the morning and in another town by night, reinventing yourself with each ticket. Freedom came printed on thin paper, stamped and dated, but speed had a cost. The old world of silence and distance began to vanish. Places that once felt impossibly far apart now crowded into one another. Letters that once carried longing now brought expectation. Waiting, once a sign of love's endurance, began to look inefficient. Even the language of affection changed. Lovers spoke of missing each other not for years, but for train schedules. "I'll arrive at 8, replaced, "I'll return when the snows melt." The rhythm of emotion shortened to fit the timetable of machines. People standing by the tracks for the first time described a strange mix of awe and fear. The train did not move. It devoured distance. Its noise drowned conversation. Its smoke blurred the horizon. Yet when it passed, it left behind a deep silence, as if the air itself needed a moment to remember what it had been before. The contrast was unsettling. The peace of centuries replaced by the breathless pulse of something new. And yet, for all its noise, the railroad became a symbol of connection. Families separated by migration could finally reunite. Immigrants arriving at coastal ports could reach the interior lands once unreachable. News travelled faster than rumour. The telegraph followed the rails, carrying messages at the speed of thought. For the first time, humanity could be in several places at once, a blessing and a confusion we have never quite outgrown. It is easy now to romanticize the age of steam, to picture elegant trains gliding across prairies under rose-coloured skies. The truth was grittier, louder, and far more human. Each polished engine had been built by hands blistered and uncelebrated. Each mile of track cost more than gold. It cost endurance. But perhaps that was fitting. The railroad was the industrial echo of every earlier story we've told, from peasants binding their fields to nomads crossing endless grass. It was, in its own way, another kind of love story. Humanity's endless desire to be closer, faster, and to mistake movement for intimacy. When night fell along the rails, the same stars that once watched over the steppe still burned above. The trains roared below, their sparks fading into darkness. The old world had not disappeared. It had simply changed tempo. And if you listen carefully under the hum of wheels, you can still hear something familiar, the sound of hearts keeping time. If the railroad was the body of progress, its heartbeat came from thousands of hands no one photographed. History celebrates inventors and executives, but the tracks themselves were laid by people whose names vanished between the ties. They came from everywhere, from Chinese villages across the Pacific, from Irish towns still healing after famine, from the American South where freedom had just been declared but not yet delivered. Together they built a road across a continent, one hammer strike at a time, and then quietly stepped aside while others posed for the picture. The western half of the line, run by the Central Pacific Company, faced the Sierra Nevada mountains, granite walls that could break men faster than tools. To cross them, engineers needed tunnels, and tunnels needed labourers. Thousands of Chinese workers were recruited, at first reluctantly, then desperately, because no one else would stay through the winters. They arrived with little English and less protection. Their daily routine began before sunrise, climbing frozen cliffs with baskets of tools and black powder. To carve each tunnel, they drilled by hand. Steel rods twisted against the rock while partners struck with hammers in a rhythm that left no room for mistakes. When dynamite was scarce, they used gunpowder packed into bamboo tubes. If it misfired, the explosion still happened just later, sometimes when they returned to check. Snow was constant, unpredictable, and sometimes alive. Entire camps disappeared under drifts. Men dug tunnels not through mountains but through snow itself, carving passageways to their own work sites. In the worst blizzards, the line froze for weeks, and food had to be hauled up by sled. Some workers died, buried where they fell. There were no markers, no official numbers. The mountain kept its silence, and the company kept the schedule. Progress, after all, did not allow for mourning. Yet the work continued. The Chinese crews built bridges from pine trunks, ladders up sheer cliffs, and scaffolds that swayed above canyons. To blast one treacherous section called the Cape Horn Curve, they were lowered in wicker baskets down the face of the cliff, swinging hundreds of feet above the river. They drilled, placed the charges, and climbed up before the explosion. It was a job so impossible that even engineers hesitated to believe it could be done. But it was quietly, perfectly by men who were paid less than half the wage of others. On the plains to the east, the Union Pacific advanced through another kind of wilderness, flat, endless, and often hostile. Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and freed black workers built the line under the glare of the sun. There were raids, fevers, and sudden storms, tents ripped apart overnight, wagons vanished into mud. The ground was easier to break than the mountains, but the danger was no less. Scurvy, dehydration, and accidents thinned the ranks as effectively as battle. They called themselves navvies, short for navigators, a word borrowed from canal builders. It sounded proud, even if the pay was not. In the middle of all this exhaustion, something miraculous happened. Competition. The two companies were paid by the mile, so both began to build toward each other with almost comic intensity. The Central Pacific raced east, the Union Pacific raced west. Each tried to outdistance the other, laying track at record speeds. In April of 1869, the Central Pacific crews, mostly Chinese, set a record. 10 miles of track in a single day. 10 miles, 16 kilometres, of rails, ties, spikes and ballast laid perfectly straight. The feat required coordination so precise it bordered on choreography. Surveyors marked the ground ahead, teams carried rails in pairs, others hammered spikes in rhythm, foremen shouted orders timed to the swing of hammers. From a distance, it must have looked less like work and more like a mechanical dance. A moving, breathing machine made of human will. When the whistle blew that evening, the line stretched farther than it had that morning, and the workers collapsed where they stood. No monuments were built for that day. The company managers celebrated profits. The newspapers printed figures, but the men simply went to sleep, knowing they would wake to start again. The 10-mile day became legend, but not a legend attached to names. It was remembered as if nature itself had done it, as though mountains and prairies had suddenly decided to cooperate. On the day the two lines finally met, the Golden Spike ceremony glittered with ceremony and absence. Cameras captured businessmen shaking hands, polished boots on polished ties. Out of frame, the workers who had laid every inch of that line stood back uninvited. Many watched from the hills, their faces smudged with coal dust and snow burns. The telegraph message went out to the world. Done. But for them, it was just another work day that happened to end early. After the spike was driven, some crews were discharged on the spot. Others found new jobs repairing the line, building depots, or simply wandering toward the next construction site. For the Chinese labourers, things grew harsher. Discrimination followed them down every track they had built. Laws began to limit their entry, their rights, their families. They had built a path that could take them anywhere, but found most destinations closed. The same country that had needed their endurance now declared them strangers. Many moved south or east to new towns, starting laundries, shops, or farms. The rhythm of hammer and spike changed, but it never stopped. It's easy when looking back to see the railroad as a symbol of triumph, and it was. But it was also a mirror, showing the cost of progress measured not just in dollars, but in silence. The men who died were not counted, but their absence formed the space between the ties. Every time a train passed, the weight of iron pressed their memory deeper into the earth. And yet, if you stand near those rails today, somewhere quiet where the old tracks still hum, you can almost hear them. The faint metallic rhythm of hammers, a heartbeat beneath the wind. History rarely thanks the hands that hold the weight. It prefers the faces that smile for the camera. But progress, stripped of its monuments, is always human. Tired, stubborn, and anonymous. The 10 miles laid in one day stand as proof, not just of ambition, but of cooperation so seamless that it became invisible. The line they built still runs, steel on steel, humming through time, and though their names were lost, the sound of their work remains, steady as a pulse, the music of effort that outlasts applause. The trains had connected oceans, but not hearts. For every man who rode west chasing work, a woman stayed behind, waiting for a letter that might never come. Progress had shortened distance, but not loneliness. The New World moved at the speed of steam, yet affection still had to travel by paper. Between the iron rails and the telegraph wires stretched another kind of frontier, one made of waiting, promises and laws that quietly decided who was allowed to love whom. When the Pacific Railway was finished, the world congratulated itself on unity. But unity has a way of skipping the fine print. Thousands of Chinese labourers who had carved tunnels and laid tracks across the mountains now wanted to bring their families to join them. They had earned wages, bought land, and built small communities along the line. Yet the same government that had paid for their labour began to fear their presence. The political language of the day called it protection. In practice, it meant exclusion. In the year 1875, Congress passed what was known as the Page Law, the first of several acts designed to limit Chinese immigration. Officially, it targeted what it called undesirable entry, but in reality, it was aimed at women. The law claimed to prevent human trafficking, but it presumed guilt. Almost any Chinese woman arriving in America was suspected of immorality until proven otherwise. The result was cruelly effective. Wives were denied entry, mothers separated from children, fiancés turned back at harbours. It was a policy of solitude disguised as virtue. So the railroad, which had promised connection, delivered separation instead. Men who had built the nation's spine were left stranded in its ribs, scattered labourers with no legal way to bring their families. Chinatowns grew not from settlement but from isolation. Communities of bachelors who sent money home and kept their longing neatly folded inside letters. A new form of romance appeared, the correspondence marriage. A photograph, a letter, a promise. Paper became both bridge and border. Mail order marriages were not unique to the Chinese. Across the plains, settlers, miners, and railroad workers of every background turned to the same method. Newspaper advertisements offered companionship to those lost in vastness. Respectable gentleman seeks wife of good character, willing to travel. Replies came from school teachers, widows, and women with dreams of adventure or escape. They exchanged photographs, locks of hair, and cautious hopes. Sometimes the couples worked, sometimes they didn't. But in an age when the nearest neighbour could be 20 miles away, even the possibility of affection was worth the postage. Letters carried both formality and fragility. Ink on paper felt permanent, yet the mail routes were unpredictable. A letter could vanish in flood, snow, or bureaucracy. Months could pass between questions and answers. To love by post required imagination. You fell for handwriting, for the way someone described weather or loneliness. You memorized their phrasing as if each sentence were a breath shared across continents. The waiting shaped the feeling. Patience became a kind of devotion. Still, even paper had boundaries. For those caught between continents and laws, love became an act of endurance. Some men saved for years to bring their wives across the Pacific, only to be met with officials demanding proof that the marriage was legitimate. How does one prove love to a bureaucracy? Photographs, affidavits, letters. Every private detail became evidence. Couples rehearsed their own history for interrogators, memorizing each other's birthdays and household items as if affection were an exam. Many failed, not for lack of truth, but for lack of patience from those asking the questions. Others never reunited. Their wives aged without them, raising children who knew their fathers only through stories and remittances. And yet the letters continued. Tidy envelopes filled with careful updates, hopes for harvests, wishes for health. Sometimes they contained pressed flowers from the homeland, flattened reminders of seasons that no longer matched. Each letter ended the same way, until we meet. Few ever did. In cities and camps, loneliness grew into its own economy. Boarding houses advertised companionship, not romance. Dance halls filled with people who pretended for a few hours that they belonged to someone. Music softened what law had hardened. There were friendships that looked like marriages and marriages that behaved like friendships, blurring the lines of propriety and survival. The human heart, confronted with separation, simply improvised. Even outside the immigrant world, the new rhythm of industrial life strained relationships. Trains moved faster than emotions could adapt. A husband could now travel hundreds of miles for work, returning home between paydays. Families lived in alternating presences, together and apart, together again. Love began to rely on schedules. The pocket watch replaced the candle as a symbol of fidelity. You promised not eternity but punctuality. The telegraph added another layer of confusion. It carried words instantly, stripped of tone and warmth. Arriving tomorrow, stop, love you, stop. Affection flattened into signals. The speed of transmission made waiting obsolete but also made feeling weightless. The miracle of instant contact introduced a quieter tragedy. The loss of texture. When everything could be said at once, nothing sounded patient anymore. Still, for all its contradictions, this was the birth of modern romance. Half real, half written. People fell in love with faces on photographs, with voices carried by wires, with descriptions of lives they would never see. They learned to imagine intimacy across distance, a skill that would later become second nature to everyone with a screen. In that sense, the 19th century was already rehearsing our future. There were, of course, those who resisted. Communities held festivals to bridge isolation. Chinese New Year parades brightened narrow streets. Irish bands played waltzes under dusty banners. Indigenous dances persisted beside new railroad towns, defying erasure through rhythm. In these moments, the human instinct to gather overpowered the loneliness of laws. Music crossed languages more easily than policy ever could. If you had stood on a station platform at dusk, you might have seen all these stories compressed into a single image. A train departing, smoke curling into gold light, a figure waving until the last car disappeared. Progress always leaves someone behind. The air smelled of coal and salt, and the whistle faded like a sigh. For every connection made, another was postponed. Love, law, and movement. Three forces forever out of sync. The century wanted to go faster, but hearts had not yet evolved to travel at that speed. We still longed for slow arrivals, for letters that took their time, for the reassurance that affection could wait. The trains taught us how to cross the world. The waiting taught us why. By the time the last spike was hammered, the rails no longer ended anywhere. They just kept going, out into the flat infinity of the Great Plains, through silence so wide it could almost swallow the sound of a train. To many, this new path looked like promise. To others, it looked like trespass, because the land it crossed was not empty. It was a living tapestry of nations, spirits, and herds, a sacred geography long before anyone called it progress. For thousands of years, the plains had been home to peoples whose lives followed the rhythm of the buffalo. Tribes such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa moved with the seasons, their journeys guided by the herd's migrations. To them, the land was not property. It was kin, a shared heartbeat stretched across horizon. The buffalo were not resources. They were relatives, givers of food, shelter, and meaning. Every part of the animal was used: hide for tents, bones for tools, sinew for thread, and heart for ceremony. Their disappearance was unimaginable, which is why, when it happened, it felt like the end of time. The railroad brought settlers, soldiers, and surveyors, men who saw the open grass not as spirit but as opportunity. Steel sliced through prairies that had known only hoofprints and wind. Telegraph poles rose like a new kind of forest, each wire humming with messages that no one nearby could read. The sound of trains startled the buffalo, scattering herds that had once moved like clouds. Hunters followed the rails, carrying rifles and greed. Buffalo hides became currency, shipped east in endless freight cars. Between the 1860s and the 1880s, tens of millions of animals vanished. From the train windows, passengers could shoot for sport. The carcasses were left to rot, whitening the plains like frost that never melted. The government called this civilization. Indigenous nations called it loss beyond measure. Treaties, once sworn in good faith, were rewritten or ignored. Promises of land and protection dissolved under waves of settlers. The railway made these encroachments inevitable. It moved armies faster than negotiation. Forts appeared along the route, and with them, new borders that no one who lived there had agreed to. The same rails that carried mail and merchandise also carried troops, weapons, and the quiet machinery of displacement. Yet the people of the plains resisted, in ways both fierce and patient. Leaders like Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse fought not for conquest, but for the right to remain whole. They understood that the railroad was not just a machine, it was a philosophy, a line that divided what had once been shared. To stop it was to stop time itself, and time, as always, refused to listen. The cultural loss that followed cannot be measured by acreage. It was measured in silences. The songs no longer sung, the migrations unmade, the languages pressed into textbooks instead of her air. Missionaries arrived with hymnals and good intentions, teaching children that their old stories were wrong. But the old stories survived anyway, passed down like embers hidden under ash. Even as buffalo bones were ground into fertilizer for eastern farms, the memory of them walked beside the survivors, invisible and enduring. Sometimes the past found small ways to speak back. A traveller once wrote of standing on the plains at dusk, when the wind shifted just right and carried a low sound that seemed like distant thunder. There were no storms, only the echo of hooves, a mirage made of memory. He didn't know what to call it, but those who lived there did. They said the land remembers its own footsteps. The expansion of the railroad changed everything, including the sky. Sparks from engines ignited dry grass. Smoke hung in the air, staining sunsets into strange colours. Birds altered their flight paths. Rivers once clear carried silt from construction. Progress left its fingerprints everywhere, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden in the stories of loss that no one wrote down. Even the word frontier, once full of wonder, began to sound tired, a polite disguise for conquest. Yet amid the destruction, fragments of connection survived. Some settlers, witnessing the waste, began to question it. Early naturalists and artists sketched the remaining herds, realizing they were watching the last shadows of a world disappearing. In their drawings, the buffalo stands solemn against empty plains, symbols of both tragedy and endurance, and in the same way that medieval Europe found holiness in saints, America began to find it in animals it had almost erased. For the indigenous nations, survival itself became ceremony. Forced onto reservations, they carried their traditions in memory. Dances, songs, and languages whispered so quietly that even the guards couldn't take them. Many turned the railroad's irony against them. They used the same trains meant to confine them to travel to fairs and exhibitions, showing their art and resilience to the world that had tried to forget them. Out of loss, they made persistence. Out of silence, they made song again. To ride a train across those plains today is to move through layers of history stacked like invisible glass. The tracks gleam, the grass waves, and the horizon still looks endless. But under every mile lies what came before: hoofprints, ashes, prayers. The names of rivers and towns echo the languages that first named them. Even the wind, when it rushes past the windows, seems to speak in syllables older than the tracks. Every civilization, when it moves fast enough, forgets what it is crossing. The trains taught the world to outrun consequence, but the earth keeps a slower ledger. It remembers. The ground still holds iron, bone and seeds, everything left behind by motion. And when thunder rolls across the plains, some say it is the buffalo returning, not in body, but in sound. For all the progress those rails carried, they also carried grief. Yet grief too travels. It moves in stories, in descendants who remember what was lost, in songs sung under stars that no train can reach. Progress may change landscapes, but it cannot erase memory completely. The world shifts, the rails rust, but the rhythm beneath them remains. A pulse as old as hooves, as steady as forgiveness trying to begin again. When the last whistle faded into the horizon, the continent finally fell silent again. The train still ran, of course, steel against steel, the steady rhythm of civilization. But the first shock of speed had passed. Humanity had built a new way to move, and now had to learn how to feel inside it. Love, distance, belonging. Everything that once had natural pace had been altered by the machinery of motion. It was progress, yes, but it also left behind a strange kind of emptiness, the echo that follows applause. In the years that came after the golden spike, people began to realise that the world no longer waited. Time, once a river with bends and still pools, had become a clock. The train schedule became a sacred text. Lives were measured in departures and arrivals, marriages in telegrams, and affection in the promise of letters that would find their way along tracks instead of trails. What had once taken seasons now took hours, and yet, for all the acceleration, loneliness didn't disappear. It just learned to move faster. At first, the new rhythm felt exhilarating. Cities glowed with lamps, stations filled with chatter, and travellers described the thrill of crossing entire landscapes before the sun set. But inside that thrill was an unease that no one wanted to name. The same people who had once prayed for movement now began to miss stillness. The world had been conquered, but at the cost of calm. The whistle of the train, once a hymn to progress, started to sound a little like longing. Writers of the era tried to capture it. They described passengers staring out of windows, faces lit by flickering lanterns, watching the landscape blur. Love stories began to feature timetables. A husband on one train, a wife waiting at another station, their letters missing each other by a single day. The industrial age had given people proximity without presence. You could reach anyone but rarely touch them. The heart had become another kind of traveller, always in motion, rarely at rest. Even in small towns the change was visible. The telegraph office replaced the village square. People gathered not to talk, but to wait for news. The rhythm of human contact shifted from conversation to notification. Quick, efficient, strangely cold. The telegraph operator became a kind of priest, translating emotion into code. Love, stop, please, right, stop, safe, journey, stop. Somewhere between the dots and dashes, intimacy turned into information. It was easier to be heard, harder to be known. And yet, amidst the noise and the smoke, tenderness survived. Couples met on platforms, holding hands while the whistle counted down their goodbye. Soldiers sent tokens from distant stations. buttons, ribbons, pressed flowers caught between train tickets. Parents sent their children to new cities and stood watching until the cars became smaller than memory. The railway taught humanity the ritual of departure, and with it the art of endurance. To love in the age of steam was to keep faith across motion, to believe that affection could survive momentum. As the century turned, the iron lines began to connect not just cities but worlds. Ships crossed oceans powered by steam, and cables under the sea carried messages in minutes instead of months. Empires stretched across time zones, their rulers governing by telegraph. Humanity had become one long conversation, spoken in every language but silence. The planet, for the first time, felt small enough to be lonely. And so the poets began to write about stillness again. They longed for the old slowness, for letters written by hand, for journeys that required waiting. Some moved to the countryside, claiming to seek nature, but really they were seeking delay. Even progress needs something to move against. Without pauses, speed loses meaning. Without distance, affection loses direction. If you look closely at photographs from the early 20th century, you can see it in people's faces, a kind of quiet exhaustion, as if they were already trying to remember what calm used to feel like. The world had become a web of movement, but the human heart still preferred rhythm to velocity. The more we connected, the more we began to miss disconnection. In that sense, the railroad didn't end the old story of love and motion. It merely changed its setting. Medieval couples had waited through winters and wars. Steppe riders had trusted wind and stars. Now lovers waited through stations and signals. Every age invents its own distance, and every distance demands its own kind of faith. What mattered was not how fast people could reach one another, but whether they remembered how to stay. There is a photograph, blurred, taken somewhere in the early 1900s, of a woman standing alone on a platform. The train beside her has already started to move. She's holding a letter in one hand and her hat with the other, her dress rippling in the wind of departure. The image is all motion except for her face, which is completely still. It captures what progress never manages to fix, the quiet truth that every invention of movement also invents a new form of waiting. Even now, more than a century later, the sound of a distant train can feel like nostalgia for a time we never lived in. It hums faintly under the noise of traffic, reminding us that the world once moved to a slower rhythm. We built machines to conquer distance, only to discover that the heart had no interest in speed. Love, unlike steel, refuses to be efficient, and perhaps that's the lesson hidden in all these centuries, from the peasants who bartered dowries, to the queens who defied kings, to the workers who built tracks across a continent. Every age finds its own way to move, but the same question follows: what do we lose when we start arriving too soon? The answer is never dramatic. It's simply this: we lose the patience that makes love feel real. So tonight, if you ever hear the low whistle of a train drifting through the dark, let it remind you, not of departure, but of connection. Somewhere, someone is still travelling towards someone else. Somewhere, a letter is still making its way home. The world turns, the rails gleam faintly, and the sound fades into sleep. Love endures, as it always has, slower than progress but far more faithful.